Hey everyone, I'm Laura and this is my tiny house. I've been living full-time in a tiny house. We moved in 2016, and this is all about how wonderful, perfect, and stress-free living in a tiny house is. I would say perfect is the best word. We've had smooth sailing since day one because living in a tiny house is awesome and there's never any problems. I have to laugh when I see things on social media about living in a tiny house. You see pictures of these meticulous, empty, tiny houses that have no clutter and barely any possessions, and it is really painted to look like this perfect, low-cost way of living. So today I'm going to talk to you about the realities of living in a tiny house and how the way that it is portrayed on social media is just not always exactly the reality of this particular lifestyle.
So don't let the weight of the world slow you down. And if you search for the meaning of life, it won't be found. So take your insecurities and leave them all behind. Let's learn to make the most of our time.
When you live in a tiny house, you immediately have to become a super minimalist. You just can't have a lot of possessions, you can't have a lot of clothing or shoes. You just automatically get rid of all those things. And your house is always pristine. Everything has a place and your items are always put away and nothing ever looks cluttered or messy. When we first moved into the tiny house, we went through a process of getting rid of a ton of stuff. We were moving from 1,400 square foot condo with 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms to 192 square feet. So we did a serious purge. We brought things to Goodwill. We did a bulk pickup with the Veterans Association. We got rid of things for weeks. And when we moved into the tiny house, we figured out that because there's no closets and there's really no storage to speak of, you have to get rid of even more stuff. But the reality is that minimalism doesn't mean owning one shirt and one pair of pants and that's it. There's a spectrum of minimalism. So all of our possessions, except for the stuff that we have in our camping bins outside, fits into our 192 square foot house. And we actually have a ton of hobbies, maybe too many hobbies. And with those hobbies come a lot of clothing, different types of shoes that we wear when we go kayaking or hiking or backpacking. We have a lot of gear. We also have a dog and he has a lot of gear. We have a wood stove, we have to have storage for wood. There's really a lot of stuff that we have to keep in our house. And I have things that I need for work and Patrick has things that he needs for work. So we actually have a fair amount of things in our tiny house. And when you see a lot of the pictures online, I think they usually show you the house before the people move into it. They take those beautiful staged pictures where there's like one potted plant on the table, no furniture, no clothing, no shoes. We have a shoe rack right next to our door because we have to put our shoes on and take them off before we go to work, and we need different shoes for doing different things, so we have to create storage for that. The reality is that if you do things in the world, you have to have gear and things to do all of those activities, and you have to figure out spaces to put those things in your tiny house. So don't feel like as soon as you move into your tiny house you have to get rid of everything. I've definitely downsized my wardrobe, but I really don't miss any of the things that I had to get rid of. I'm just a little bit smarter when I buy things. If I have to get a new outfit, I really think about how versatile that outfit is. Am I going to wear it again? Can I wear it for different occasions? And that sort of thing. Instead of just going to the store and buying something because I like it and I don't have any specific reason for buying it, you kind of get out of those habits because you don't want your space to feel cluttered. You don't want to have too much stuff. So there's definitely a shift in terms of having fewer things, but you don't have to get rid of everything. Living in a tiny house is such a low-cost way of living. You're pretty much going to be able to quit your job and retire early, or, you know, start a business selling artisanal jams on the side of the road. And that's going to cover all your expenses, because when you live in a tiny house, you just don't really have bills anymore. One of the things that I actually consider to be one of the greatest benefits of living in a tiny house is that it significantly changes your cost of living. You are taking one of the biggest bills that you have every single month, which is usually your mortgage or your rent, and you are bringing that down to a much smaller amount of money. For us, it was more than half. But the reality is that we both still have full-time jobs because you still have a lot of expenses outside of just housing. Now, we pay a lot fee for where we have our tiny house parked, and we have to pay for electricity. The lot fee includes our sewer and our water. So we still have to pay for our propane, and we still have to pay for our electricity. We also have 2 cars because we both work, so we have to pay car insurance and gas and all of the lovely bills that come with owning cars. We both have health insurance, and health insurance is a big expense that we both have every single month. Food, all of those normal things that you still have in day-to-day life, you still have all of those bills when you live in a tiny house. You will have a little bit more disposable income because your housing cost is lower, and your utility bills will be lower because when you're heating and cooling 192 square feet, it's going to cost less, and it's going to require less energy than if you have a 5-bedroom house that you are paying the utilities on. So that can be a big savings. But the reality is that living in a tiny house still costs money. You're still going to need a job. It's going to give you a little bit more wiggle room. And actually, the reality is a lot of people think we just like travel all the time and do whatever we want, but we actually go on a smaller trip twice a year, and then we take weekend trips in between there, and we can allocate a little bit more money toward our travel budget because we're not paying a mortgage right now. But our next step in living in a tiny house is going to be buying property to put the house on. And property is expensive, property taxes, and when you buy property with no improvements on it, most people have to pay cash for that. So you have to have a sizable chunk of money. So for a good portion of this year, both Patrick and myself were actually working 6 days a week with that end goal of saving up enough money to buy our own piece of property that we could put the tiny house on. So you will definitely still need to have a job and need to have income to live the tiny house lifestyle, but it was a key piece of me getting myself out of debt, paying off my student loans, and revamping our whole look at our finances over the past few years. Tiny houses are so small that you can just hook them up to a truck and roll down the road and park them wherever you want. You can relocate as many times as you feel like moving during the year, and it's really pretty easy to just move your home wherever you want to be. So that's a pretty good perk of living in a tiny house. The day that our house was delivered was the first day that Patrick and I set eyes on a tiny house in person. And the very first thought that I had when I saw her coming around the corner was, oh my gosh, that is not tiny. She's very tall because we have a loft and a storage loft. Our house is about as tall as a semi-truck. It's the maximum height that you can have to legally be on the road, so it really makes use of the vertical space. So she's very tall. Our house is 8 feet wide by 24 feet long, so about the size of some people's RVs. But the difference is that a tiny house is made with house materials. So we have real cabinets and wood and flooring and drywall. So this is heavy. And we've added a wood stove and furniture and all of those things since our house was delivered over 6 years ago. So she's a lot heavier now than she was the day that she got delivered. And the story goes that our builder, this was his first house that he was actually delivering to a customer, and he tried to hook up his own truck. I forget what kind of truck he had, but he tried to pull the house with his truck, and he made it a little ways away from his shop in Chicago and decided that it was too much strain on his truck. So he called a hotshot who had a diesel, and it was like a big dually, and he came and picked up the house and brought it the rest of the way. And he had like a substantial truck. So the tiny house is very heavy, and you need a substantial vehicle if you want to be able to move it. That being said, it is a production to move this. It's not something that you just hook up like if you have an RV and you're like, oh, let me just move the RV. RVs are made of very light materials. They are made to move on a regular basis. Where tiny houses, you're kind of sacrificing some of that mobility to have materials that are sturdier, that feel more like a home. You don't have as much plastic and kind of lightweight materials around you. Our house has metal siding, metal roofing, everything is very sturdy and made to last. But that means that it's also very hard to move. Now, if we had a giant truck, we might be able to move it ourselves, but more than likely when we get our piece of property and we're going to move the house to that property, we're probably going to hire a professional to do that, because we want to make sure that when our home is rolling down the road, that everything goes smoothly. Once you're done building your tiny house, or once your tiny house gets delivered, you're going to have it so easy because these are so low maintenance. If you pick the right building materials, everything is going to be so easy to take care of. You're never going to have to spend your weekend fixing things or replacing things. That doesn't happen in a tiny house. The reality is that houses are complicated. No matter if you have a large house or a small house, there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of complicated systems that go into a tiny house, just like a regular house. And if you've seen our past videos, you know that the tiny house has not been maintenance free for us. We've had fridges break, hot water heaters, we've had leaks, we've had to replace the flooring, we've had so many different things over the 6.5 years that we have had to address and replace and repair. And that has just been part of the process, but I know the same thing happens to people when you live in a regular house. One of the differences is that if you have to replace something in a traditional house, like we redid our flooring, we only have 192 square feet to pay for, where in a bigger house you're going to have to probably cover a much bigger area. The other issue that we have run into is one day we had a leak and we called a plumber, and the plumber would not work on the tiny house, because even though we call this a tiny house, this is actually an RV. The title and the paperwork, and from a legal standpoint, this is an RV. It's just built with house materials, and it's built to look more homey and like a house, but it is actually an RV. So if you call a plumber who does not work on RVs, they're not going to work on your house. We had that happen. So instead, when we had to repair our hot water system, we had to call an RV specialist. And you know, when there's a specialist on there, it's going to cost you a little bit more for that type of work. So something to keep in mind: if you have to fix something, you might have to find an RV specialist instead of just a regular handyman. Because tiny houses are so small and they are on wheels, you can pretty much put them wherever you want. You can put them in your parents' backyard. If you want to buy that empty lot next door, park your tiny house on it. You can live wherever you want to. It's great. When we bought our tiny house, we knew that it was going to be challenging to work around the laws and the zoning. Originally, we were thinking about parking the tiny house on somebody's property. and just paying them some rent every month and kind of using some of their utilities. But we figured out pretty quickly that, especially in New Jersey, but really in most states, the zoning and the laws have not caught up to the tiny house movement. And although you do see tiny houses a lot more frequently nowadays, most of the tiny houses that we know of that people live in legally are on a lot, just like ours. So we live in an RV park and we rent a lot. And because the tiny house is technically an RV, we're not allowed to use this as our mailing address or our permanent home address because it's an RV, so it doesn't have an address. And that's one of the big issues with living in a tiny house. You're not just going to put a mailbox out and go get your mail. And you definitely cannot just park it on a piece of land. We knew our end goal with the tiny house was to buy a piece of property and put the tiny house on it and just have a simpler way of living. The reality is that I think actually just going out and buying a traditional home would be simpler because that's what everybody does. That's what the realtors know what to do with. That's what you find on Zillow. That's the easier thing. When we are looking for property to put our tiny house on, we're actually very, very limited to the townships and the states that will actually allow us to live legally in a tiny house or in an RV. So we're looking at some very specific areas to make that happen. And we've kind of figured out that New Jersey is just not the place. We have looked for loopholes and all sorts of different options and thought about buying a property with an already existing house and seeing if we could put the RV in the back. New Jersey just says no. And they will not allow you to do it legally. So the reality that we came to is that if we want to continue to live in the tiny house, we're probably going to have to move to a state that is friendlier to RVs. And that's definitely something you want to consider. I've also read articles recently about people who got in trouble with zoning boards and townships because they parked their tiny house in a family member's backyard and the township found out about it and they got in trouble. So if you are thinking about getting a tiny house, don't think that you can just put it wherever you want because the town's going to find out, and if you're not doing it legally, things are definitely going to turn into a giant headache. So keep that in mind, but also if you're thinking about going through that process of getting the tiny house and trying to put it on your own piece of property, it's not a simple process. It is not going to be stress-free. It's actually involving quite a bit of research, and it's hard to get straight answers because tiny houses are newer, and you know government, it's not going to change quickly if it changes at all. So they really don't know what to tell you. When I have called zoning offices and asked, hey, can we put our tiny house on this property? And the person on the other side of the phone has no idea what I'm asking them or what I'm talking about. So that makes it hard to ask questions and get answers. So definitely keep that in mind. When you live in a tiny house, you won't have to spend your whole day cleaning. You can pretty much clean the whole house in like 5 minutes because there's nothing to it and there's nothing around to collect dust. So what are you even going to be cleaning anyway? One of the things that I was actually the most surprised about when we moved into the tiny house was how dirty it gets. I really thought that the switch from moving from the condo to the tiny house meant that I was going to spend no time at all cleaning, which now sounds pretty ridiculous to me because if you've ever traveled in an RV, you know that you're constantly tracking things in. The floor is always dirty, and that's kind of how it is in the tiny house. We have our Dyson vacuum on the wall because there's always something on the floor that needs to be vacuumed up, especially if you have one of these guys. Dog hair getting all over the place, tracking things in and out, especially if it's raining or snowing, it's a giant mess. And things in general just need to be dusted and cleaned more. Pretty much absolutely everything in the tiny house is a high wear surface. The floor is super high wear, the countertop, All of our trim needs to be painted a little bit more frequently because things get scuffed. So it's definitely less time overall for me to vacuum the floor because it's so little square footage, but I have to do it very regularly. So you're definitely not going to get out of cleaning from living in a tiny house. It's just something that you're going to have to do shorter periods of time, but pretty much every day. Even with all of the challenges and surprises of living in a tiny house, we are still really glad that we made the choice to do this. We still enjoy living in a tiny house, and we feel like for us and for our lifestyle, the benefits have outweighed the costs and the challenges. So we're really happy to be able to live this lifestyle. But I hope this video helped you to get a more realistic picture of some of the challenges that you could face if you are thinking about living in a tiny house, or if you just wanted to know what it's really like living in such a small space. You can check out some of our other videos that we have that really tell the story of spending the winter in a tiny house, some of the things that have broken, all of the work that we put into the tiny house, and the ongoing process of keeping everything looking nice and fixed up, because that is definitely one of the big challenges in such a small space.
Well, you worried about you and me, the injustice, the next president to be, the news and what you hear, your career. It's time for you to face those fears, and it's all fair to be aware, and I'll be there, so don't be scared. Just take a deep breath of air, and 1, 2, 3 to 10, you begin to focus again, and though time flies, we have enough to realize this bigger than the both of us.